The fist hit the door so hard the lantern swayed on its hook inside, sending amber shadows lurching across the walls like frightened animals. Catherine Sutton had been awake for 2 hours already, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a letter she had read 12 times without fully understanding. When that knock came, she was on her feet before her mind caught up with her body, and some deep animal instinct told her that whatever stood on the other side of that door was going to change everything she thought she knew about her life in Harrow Creek, Texas. She pulled back the latch and the door swung open, and there he was, Alfred Slater, Deputy Sheriff of Crockett County, his face streaked with dust and dried sweat, his dark eyes burning with something she had never seen in them before, not in 3 years of quiet knowing and careful distance. His horse was still blowing hard behind him, foam at the bit, flanks heaving, the animal's breath rising in white clouds against the cold October night of 1882. "They are coming at first light," Alfred said, and his voice was low and tight as a drawn wire. "So pack now." Catherine stared at him. The world seemed to tilt a fraction to the left. "Alfred, what are you, Catherine?" He stepped forward and took her by both shoulders, and she could feel the heat radiating off him, feel the trembling in his hands that he was trying to suppress and failing. "There is no time for questions right now. Get your important things. Everything you cannot leave behind. We have to be gone before the sun comes up." She pulled back just enough to look at him fully. The deputy badge on his chest was bent, she noticed, the left corner of it pushed in as though someone had struck it with force, or as though he had ridden hard enough through dense brush that the land itself had tried to stop him. There was a cut along his jaw that had bled and dried into a dark line. His coat was torn at one shoulder. "How long did you ride?" she whispered. 9 hours, he said. "I left Redstone at dusk. Now please, Catherine, please listen to me. There is not a single minute to spare." That was when she understood, not just with her head but somewhere deeper, that the secret she had been carrying for 7 months had finally broken through the surface, that the buried thing had risen, and that the man standing in her doorway had ridden through 9 hours of Texas darkness specifically and only for her. She stepped back and let him in, and the story of how they had arrived at this impossible moment began to unspool in her mind like thread from a broken spool, tangling in the firelight, impossible to gather back. 7 months earlier, in the early spring of 1882, Catherine Sutton had arrived in Harrow Creek on the afternoon stage from San Antonio with 2 leather trunks, a carpet bag, a box of seeds, and a past she intended to leave buried behind her in the dust of the road. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair the color of creek walnut shells and gray eyes that people tended to describe as serious before they described them as pretty. She was not what most people in a small West Texas cattle town expected when they heard the word schoolteacher, which is to say she was not meek. She was not small-voiced, and she did not smile at men just because they were smiling at her. She had been hired by letter to take over the Harrow Creek schoolhouse after the previous teacher, a Mr. Harmon Cleaves, had gotten himself shot in a dispute over cards at the Painted Lady Saloon. The school board, which consisted of 3 cattle ranchers, a feed store owner, and the Presbyterian minister, had been so desperate that they accepted her application without asking many questions, which suited Catherine perfectly. She had questions of her own that she was not prepared to answer, the most important of which was this. In San Antonio, she had witnessed something she was never supposed to see, and the man she had seen doing it was not a man who forgave witnesses. His name was Beaumont Hale, and he was one of the most respected men in the state of Texas, if respect was the word you used for a man who owned 6,000 acres, a private militia he called his range riders, and enough political connections in Austin to make judges disappear from their benches. On the night of March the 3rd, 1882, Catherine had been walking home late from the house of her friend Dorothea Beale, where she had stayed past dark helping with a new baby, and she had taken the alley behind the cotton exchange to avoid the long way around. She had seen Beaumont Hale standing over a man named George Tasker, a land surveyor who had been hired by the federal government to resurvey the western portions of Crockett County, because there were strong suspicions that Hale's land grants had been fraudulently extended into public territory, and more critically, into land that had been promised by treaty to Comanche and Apache communities, who were already navigating impossible circumstances at the edge of a world that was being taken from them piece by piece. Tasker was already dead when Catherine turned the corner. She did not see the shot fired. She saw Hale standing over the body. She saw Hale's face turned toward her for one terrible moment in the light spilling from a high window, and then she ran. She ran for 4 blocks. She did not stop. She went home. She packed her trunks, and by the next morning she had already written the letter requesting the teaching position in Harrow Creek, which was 170 miles away from San Antonio, deep enough in the scrub desert of West Texas that she had wagered Beaumont Hale would not immediately think to look for her there. She had been right about that for 7 months. She was about to be devastatingly wrong. The Harrow Creek schoolhouse was a single room with 12 desks, a potbelly stove, a chalkboard that had been whitewashed from black because a proper slate chalkboard had not yet arrived from the manufacturer in St. Louis, and a hand-pump organ in the corner that no one had managed to tune in 3 years. The children were a mixture of rancher offspring, the children of small homesteaders trying to grow something in difficult soil, and a few whose parents worked in the town businesses. They ranged from 6 to 14 years old, and they were, in Catherine's private estimation, among the finest young people she had ever taught, sharp-minded and curious, and brutally honest in the way that only children raised close to hard country could be. She had been in Harrow Creek for 2 weeks when she first met Alfred Slater, and the meeting was not romantic in any conventional sense of the word. She had been walking from the general store with a bundle of chalk and a box of arithmetic primers when she turned a corner and walked directly into him, scattering chalk across the boardwalk and sending 3 primers into the street, where one of them landed in a puddle from the previous night's rain. Alfred Slater bent down and picked up the wet primer without a word and wiped it against his vest and handed it back to her. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, weathered quality that came from years of outdoor work in unforgiving country. He had dark brown hair and dark eyes, and a jaw that suggested he was accustomed to holding things back. He was wearing his deputy badge and carrying a rifle. "Sorry about the book," he said. "The chalk is more my concern," she said. "Chalk doesn't dry out." He looked down at the pieces scattered across the boardwalk and then back at her, and something almost like humor moved through his expression and disappeared before it could become a smile. "I'll buy you new chalk," he said. "You'll do no such thing. It was as much my fault as yours." They looked at each other for a moment longer than the situation required. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. "I am Catherine Sutton, Alfred Slater, deputy." "I can see that," she said, glancing at his badge, and this time the near smile came back. They parted ways, and she walked home with her damp primer and did not think about him again that day, except that she did briefly, at odd intervals, for reasons she chose not to examine too closely. In the weeks that followed, Harrow Creek arranged itself around Catherine in the way that small towns did, pressing close with its details, its gossip, its need for her to be known and categorized. She learned quickly that Deputy Alfred Slater was considered both the most reliable and the most private man in the county. He had been born in Missouri, served as a Union soldier at the age of 19 toward the tail end of the war, come west afterward with nothing but a horse and a skill with a rifle, and ended up in Crockett County more or less by accident, which was how most people ended up in West Texas. He had worked as a ranch hand for 3 years, then as a cattle driver, then been hired on as a deputy by Sheriff Virgil Moss 7 years ago. He was 30 years old. He had never married. He owned a small house at the edge of town and a dog named Pocket. Catherine learned these things from Mrs. Delphine Hurst, who kept the boarding house where Catherine rented a room and who had clearly strong opinions about the deputy. "Good man," said Mrs. Hurst firmly, slicing bread with the authority of someone rendering a verdict. "Keeps himself to himself, which some people mistake for coldness but isn't." Catherine filed this information alongside everything else she was gathering about Harrow Creek, carefully and without sentiment. She was not in a position to form attachments. She was in a position to stay quiet, teach her students, and wait to feel safe again. What she had not accounted for was how quickly Alfred Slater would notice that she was afraid. He noticed within the first month. She did not know he had noticed until the second month, when he fell into step beside her one evening as she walked back from the school after staying late to prepare the following week's lessons. The sun was going down in the particular violent way it did in West Texas, streaking the sky orange and red above the flat horizon. "You check the street before you step out of the schoolhouse," he said without preamble. "You sit with your back to the wall when you eat at the Granger's table. You don't use the lamp after dark if you can help it." She did not reply. "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm just telling you what I've observed." She walked 3 more steps in silence. "And what do you do with your observations, deputy?" "Nothing," he said. "Unless you want me to." She glanced at him sideways. His expression was completely neutral, entirely without pressure. He was offering a door and making absolutely clear that he would not push her through it. "I came from San Antonio," she said carefully. "I left some trouble behind." "Most people who come to West Texas did," he said. "This trouble has a name," she said. "And he is not a small man." Something shifted in Alfred's posture, barely perceptible, a slight squaring of the shoulders. "If you ever want to tell me the name," he said, "I'll be ready to listen." She did not tell him that night, or the next week, or the month after that. But the door he had opened did not close, and she found herself aware of it in a way she could not entirely explain. The way you were aware of a fire in a room, even when you were looking somewhere else, the warmth of it at the edge of your attention, the comfort of it underneath everything. She started talking to him in small, careful increments. She would stop to exchange a few words when she saw him on her morning walk to the school. He would sometimes meet her at the general store and carry the heavier items for her without making a fuss about it. On Sunday afternoons, when the weather was fine, he would occasionally be at the same outdoor spot near the creek where she sometimes went to read, and they would sit within comfortable distance of each other and not say much. And she discovered that this quality of his, this ability to be present without demanding anything, was one of the rarest things she had ever encountered in a person. She began to trust him with small things, then medium things. Then one evening in late July, sitting on the porch steps of the boarding house while fireflies moved through the dark, she told him about the alley behind the Cotton Exchange and the dead surveyor and Beaumont Hale's face turned toward her in the light. Alfred was quiet for a long time. "You haven't told anyone else," he said. It was not a question. "No." "Good," he said, and the quiet way he said it made her stomach tighten because it meant he already understood the stakes without her having to draw him a map. "You know who he is," she said. "Everyone in Texas knows who he is." "Do you know what he is?" Alfred looked at the dark line of the horizon. "I've heard things. Rumors about land fraud, about the surveyor disappearing in San Antonio. I didn't know there was a witness." "There is," Catherine said. "She's sitting beside you." He turned and looked at her, and for a moment in the warm summer darkness with the fireflies around them, the expression on his face was so unguarded that it nearly undid her, something fierce and protective and very nearly tender. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. "That is a very large promise to make," she said quietly. "I am aware of that," he said. "I'm making it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the reasons this was foolish, and all the reasons it should not matter to her, and all the reasons she should politely tell him that she had survived this long on her own strength and did not require a guardian. She thought all of those things in a great rapid rush, and then she thought about how 9 hours from now or 9 months from now the world might look entirely different, and how the only real thing in this moment was the warmth of sitting close to someone she had come to care about in ways that frightened her more than Beaumont Hale did. "Thank you, Alfred," she said softly. He nodded once, and they sat there a little longer in the dark. The weeks that followed were some of the most complicated of Catherine's life, because she was simultaneously trying not to fall in love with Alfred Slater and failing at it with increasing completeness. Every time she managed to rebuild the careful professional distance between them, something would happen to dismantle it again. He brought her a new tin of chalk one morning, left on the schoolhouse steps with no note, just the tin. She found him late one afternoon, repairing the broken latch on the schoolhouse door that she had mentioned offhand needed fixing. When one of her older students, a 14-year-old boy named Pete Garland, came to school with marks on him that made Catherine's blood run cold, it was Alfred who handled the situation with his father with a directness that was entirely devoid of cruelty and entirely full of consequence, and the marks did not appear again. She watched him be the kind of man that West Texas desperately needed more of. She watched him be fair to the Mexican homesteaders who were regularly harassed by the larger ranching operations, watched him speak to the Comanche traders who came through town with the kind of basic respect that most people in Harrow Creek completely failed to extend, watched him stand between the drunk and the vulnerable without making it a spectacle. He was not perfect. He had a temper that he kept leashed, but she could see it straining sometimes, and he was not always patient with fools, and there were evenings when he went very quiet in a way that suggested he carried things she did not yet know the shape of. But he was deeply, stubbornly, earnestly good, and she had not known how much she had been starved for that quality until she found herself in its vicinity. By September she had stopped pretending she was not in love with him and had simply transferred her energy into pretending it did not matter, which worked slightly better as a strategy in that it required less active effort. Alfred, for his part, was doing his own version of the same thing. She could see it. She was not a naive woman, and she had known enough people in her life to recognize the particular quality of attention that meant more than it was willing to say. He listened to her in the specific way that meant everything she said was being carefully kept. He laughed at things she said with a spontaneity that was the most honest thing about him. When they accidentally touched, when hands brushed over a shared object or she stepped close to show him something and her arm came against his, there was a fractional pause in him that had nothing to do with physical discomfort and everything to do with its opposite. But neither of them moved. The stakes were too clear. She was a woman with a dangerous secret in a town where she might need to run at any moment. He was a man with a badge and responsibilities and a quiet dark past that he had not yet shared with her. Moving toward each other felt like risking something that neither of them could afford to lose once they had it. What broke the careful stillness was not a romantic gesture. It was a letter. On the second day of October, a letter arrived for Catherine at the boarding house with no return address, postmarked from Austin. She opened it at the kitchen table with Mrs. Hurst's cat watching her from the windowsill, and what she read made the room go very cold. The letter said, "We know where you are. Stop while you can. This is the only warning you will receive." It was not signed. She sat with that letter for 2 hours, which was how long it took her to understand that she had been found, that the 7 months of careful quiet in Harrow Creek had been a borrowed thing, that the clock which had been ticking since March had reached some critical moment. Then she put the letter in the inner pocket of her coat and she went to find Alfred. She found him at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Virgil Moss was out of town, having ridden to Redstone the previous day for a meeting with the county commissioners that was expected to take 3 days. Alfred was alone at the desk, doing paperwork, and he took one look at her face when she came through the door and stood up immediately. She gave him the letter. He read it once very fast, then he read it again slower. "When did this come?" he said. "This morning. Does anyone else know?" "No." He was quiet for a moment and she watched him thinking, watched his jaw set in that particular way. "Hale has people in Austin," he said. "He's had time to track where you came from, Someone in San Antonio who knew you probably talked, or he had people watching mail routes. It doesn't matter how he found you. What matters is what happens next. What does happen next? She said, and she heard the controlled fear in her own voice and hated it. Alfred looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He crossed the room and took her hands in both of his, just held them, steady and warm. "You are not going to face this alone," he said. She wanted to tell him she was not afraid. She wanted to project the kind of calm competence she had been performing for 7 months. What came out instead was a single breath that shook a little at the edges. "I don't know how to do this, Alfred," she said quietly. "I have been running alone for a long time." "You're not running alone anymore," he said. They stood like that for a moment, and then she collected herself, and they sat down at the desk and made a plan. It was not a fully satisfying plan because the information they had was incomplete, but the outline of it was this. Alfred would write to his contact at the federal marshal's office in Austin, a man named Cooper Reese whom he trusted, and give him everything Catherine knew about Beaumont Hale and the murder of George Tasker. Catherine would write out a full sworn statement while Alfred witnessed it. They would keep 2 copies, one hidden in the schoolhouse and one with Alfred. If Hale moved against Catherine directly, she would have the protection of being a federal witness whose testimony was already on record. It was a plan that required time and patience, 2 things that felt in very short supply. Alfred walked her home that evening and they stood on the boarding house porch in the cooling night air, and she was very aware that his hands were still holding hers and had been for most of the walk without either of them acknowledging it. "I'll sleep better knowing you're thinking about this too," she admitted. "I've been thinking about it since July," he said. She looked up at him. The porch lantern was warm above them and the town was quiet and in a different life. At a different moment, this would have been the kind of evening people wrote letters home about. "Alfred," she said. "Catherine," he said, and the way he said her name with that particular quiet weight made her feel that it was not just her name but something larger, something he had been carrying for a long time. She did not plan what happened next. She simply moved closer to him, and he met her halfway, and the kiss they shared was brief and careful and absolutely incandescent in its honesty. 2 people who had been circling each other for months finally allowing the distance to collapse. When they stepped back from each other, there was no awkwardness. Just a profound, still moment in which they were both looking at each other and understanding, mutually and without any need for further translation, exactly what this was and what it meant. "That was probably unwise," she said softly. "Probably," he agreed, and he was smiling properly this time openly, and it transformed his face so completely that she caught her breath. "I am not taking it back," she said. "Neither am I," he said. He squeezed her hands once and released them and stepped back. "Lock your window tonight," he said. "Always do," she said. He walked down the porch steps and she watched him go until the dark swallowed him. And then she stood there in the warm lamplight for a long moment before going inside. And she pressed her fingers briefly against her lips, and something in her chest that had been pulled very tight for 7 months had loosened just a fraction. The following days had the peculiar quality of heightened reality that came from living simultaneously inside a quiet routine and a building danger. Catherine taught her classes with the same careful attention she always brought to them. She wrote out her sworn statement at her kitchen table at night, 9 pages in her precise handwriting, laying out every detail of what she had seen in the alley behind the Cotton Exchange in San Antonio on the night of March 3rd. She described Beaumont Hale with exactness. She described George Tasker's body. She described the quality of the light and the silence and the way Hale had looked directly at her face before she ran. Alfred wrote his letter to Cooper Reese at the federal marshal's office. He sent it by a trusted rider to Redstone, from where it would go on the stage to Austin. They met in the evenings when they could, ostensibly walking or sitting near the creek, actually talking through the shape of the danger and what to do about it. And alongside all of that practical necessity, there was this other thing, this new and fragile and extraordinary thing between them that was growing at a pace that neither of them had been prepared for. They were falling in love with a speed and completeness that would have been terrifying under any circumstances, and was doubly so given the circumstances they were actually in. Alfred told her things she suspected he had not told another living person. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen at 19 years old that had made the world permanently darker in certain specific ways. He told her about the man he had killed in Missouri when he was 22, a man who had been in the act of murdering someone else, a clean kill in the moral sense, and yet one that sat permanently in the lower part of his chest like a weight. He told her about a woman he had known in Abilene 7 years ago, before he came to Crockett County, who had left him without explanation, and whom he had not let himself fully invest in anyone since. "Until now," he said quietly, looking at the creek. "Apparently." She reached over and covered his hand with hers. "Until now," she agreed. She told him things she had kept in tightly sealed places. She told him about her mother dying when she was 8 and her father, a schoolteacher himself, raising her alone in Ohio with a kind of remote, dedicated love that had taught her to be competent and had not taught her to be warm. She told him about coming to Texas at 23 with a fiancé who had decided 6 months after they arrived that the West was too hard and had gone back east without her. And she had stayed because she had already fallen in love with the landscape even as her heart was in the process of being broken. She told him about Dorothea Beale in San Antonio, who had been her closest friend, and about the terrible guilt of leaving without properly explaining, of leaving Dorothea to wonder what had happened to her. "You couldn't risk a letter that could be traced," he said. "I know, it doesn't make the guilt smaller." "No," he said, "it wouldn't." He understood the nature of impossible choices because he had made enough of them himself. This was part of what made talking to him feel like breathing after a long time of not quite enough air. October moved forward with the particular beauty of a West Texas autumn, the days still warm but the nights cooling sharply, the scrub brush going rust gold on the hills, the sky that deep flawless blue that seemed to go back forever. The students were deep into their autumn term, and several of them were making real progress that gave Catherine a quiet joy. A girl named Ellen Prout, who had arrived barely able to read, was working through a reader 2 levels above where she had started. 2 brothers named Josiah and Max Tremblay, who had been fighting each other since the first day of school, had settled into a competitive friendship that was actually improving both their mathematics. Catherine was more invested in these children than she had expected to be, more rooted in this place than was safe. She was aware of that. She was aware that she had built something here she would not want to leave. She held that awareness the way you held a hot coal, carefully, with respect for what it could do to you. On the 12th of October, Sheriff Virgil Moss returned from Redstone with news that changed the shape of everything. He came into the schoolhouse just as Catherine was releasing the children at the end of the day, his big hat in his hands, his face carefully arranged in a way that meant he was controlling his expression. Sheriff Moss was a heavy-set man of 50 with a gray mustache and honest eyes, the kind of sheriff who had survived 20 years in rough country by being fundamentally fair and not entirely corruptible, which in 1882 in West Texas was no small achievement. "Miss Sutton," he said, waiting until the last child had gone. "Do you have a minute?" She did. What Moss told her was this: the meeting with the county commissioners in Redstone had not been primarily about routine county business. A man named Delaney, who served as a liaison for Beaumont Hale's land interests, had been at the meeting. He had raised, in the most polished and indirect way possible, the question of a schoolteacher in Harrow Creek who might be spreading slanderous rumors about prominent Texas citizens, and suggested that the county would benefit from looking into the matter. Moss had not given Delaney anything, but he was telling Catherine because he thought she deserved to know. "You know who Beaumont Hale is," Catherine said. "I know what he is," Moss said grimly. "I also know I'm one county sheriff, and he has the kind of influence that makes county sheriffs retire early. What I can do is make it very clear to Delaney that I will not be used as a tool against honest citizens in my county. What I cannot guarantee is what happens when his people decide to move without asking for official cooperation." Catherine thanked him and Moss left, and she sat at her desk in the empty schoolhouse for a long time looking at the chalkboard. She had not written a word in the lesson for tomorrow. She had written, without quite realizing it, in the bottom corner of the board, "How much time is left?" She erased it. Alfred came that evening and she told him everything Moss had said. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the wall of the schoolhouse with his arms crossed, his expression that controlled, concentrated thing it became when he was processing danger. "Hale is getting impatient," Alfred said. "He's moved from warning to official pressure. The next step is something less official. How long do you think we have?" He looked at her steadily. "Days, maybe, not weeks," she nodded. She had suspected this. Hearing it said plainly still had weight. "Alfred," she said, "I need you to understand something. Tell me." "I am not going to run again," she said, and her voice was quiet but absolutely unambiguous. "I am done running. I have a statement on paper. I have 9 pages of truth that I wrote with my own hand. Whatever comes, I am going to face it here." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was complicated and deep. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "You're not going to argue with me. Would it work?" "Absolutely not." "Then no," he said. "I'm not going to argue with you." He crossed the room to her and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was startling from such a large, contained man, and he kissed her with a kind of deliberate, complete attention that made everything else go momentarily quiet. When he pulled back, his dark eyes were very close to hers. "I love you," he said, simply and without decoration. "I don't imagine the timing could be much worse, but there it is." She felt the words move through her like warmth and like terror in equal proportion. "Alfred Slater," she said softly, "you have the worst possible timing of any man I have ever known." "I know," he said. "Do you love me back?" She put her hands over his. "Yes," she said, "completely and inconveniently and with no way to take it back even if I wanted to, which I don't." He pressed his forehead against hers and she closed her eyes, and in that one moment, the whole shape of the danger seemed to draw back just far enough to let in this other thing, this impossibly real and present and alive thing. Then the moment passed and they were back in it, and they pulled apart and looked at each other, and the practical, necessary reality of the situation reasserted itself. "What do we do?" she said. "I'm waiting to hear back from Cooper Reese," Alfred said. "If he can get a federal warrant for Hale based on your testimony, that changes the whole picture. Hale becomes the hunted instead of the hunter. And if Reese doesn't move fast enough," Alfred's jaw tightened, "then we deal with whatever comes." They were not to have the luxury of waiting to find out. 3 days after this conversation, on the 15th of October, Alfred was out in the eastern part of the county investigating a report of cattle theft when a rider came through Harrow Creek from Redstone. The rider was not anyone Catherine knew. He stopped at the Painted Lady, had a drink, asked a few casual questions about the schoolteacher in that offhand way that was not offhand at all, and then rode back out. Mrs. Hurst came to the schoolhouse at the end of the day to tell Catherine what she had seen and heard. Mrs. Hurst was a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and was profoundly territorial about her boarders. "He was asking where you lived," Mrs. Hurst said. "He was asking your routine, when you came and went. I didn't like his face." "Did he give a name?" "He did not," said Mrs. Hurst, who had clearly found this suspicious on its own. "He paid for his drink in new coin, not the kind of coin that comes from ordinary working." Catherine thanked her, and after Mrs. Hurst left, she sat with the cold knowledge that the timeline had just compressed. The rider was a scout, which meant that whoever he was scouting for was not far behind. Alfred came back to town that evening, and she told him immediately. She watched something in his expression close down into a particular focused quality, the quality of a man who had made a decision. "I'm going to ride to Redstone tonight," he said. "There's a telegraph there. I need to reach Cooper Reese directly. I've been waiting for a letter to travel through the regular post, and that's too slow." "You'd be leaving me here alone," she said. "Moss is here, And you'll lock your door and keep your rifle ready, and I'll be back by dawn." He paused. "Unless you'd rather come with me." "If I go with you, it makes my flight look like guilt," she said. "I teach my students tomorrow as normal. I keep my routine." Hale's men won't move against a schoolteacher in a populated town in the middle of the day. He clearly did not love this plan. He looked at her for a long time. "Alfred," she said, "go to Redstone, send the telegram, come back by dawn." He went. What neither of them had known was that the rider in the painted lady had not gone back to Redstone. He had circled the town and made camp in the brush 5 miles to the north. And that same night, he had sent a message by a second rider to a group of 8 men who were waiting in Redstone with horses and weapons, and very specific instructions from Beaumont Hale about what was to happen to the woman who had seen him in that alley in San Antonio. The instructions were not gentle. Alfred reached Redstone at 4 in the morning, a punishing 9-hour ride that he pushed through on sheer determination and the kind of focused fury that came from caring very specifically about what happened to a very specific person. He went directly to the telegraph office, woke the operator out of bed without an apology, and sent his telegram to Cooper Reese with everything he had. He was waiting for the response when one of Redstone's night deputies came to the office and told him what he had just heard at the saloon, that 8 men had ridden out before midnight heading toward Harrow Creek, paid men, armed and riding hard, with the name of a woman. Alfred looked at the telegraph key for 1 second. Then he went to his horse. He rode back the way he had come at a pace that was beyond what was safe, what was smart, what was sustainable for a horse who had already made the journey once. But the horse was good, and he pushed it with everything he had, and he thought about Catherine alone in the boarding house with her locked door and her rifle. Catherine who had said she was not going to run again. Catherine who had 9 pages of handwritten truth that represented the bravest thing he had ever witnessed a person do. And he rode. He rode through the cold dark of the October night with the stars very clear and very cold above the Texas flats, and the scrub brushed silver in the moonlight on either side of the road, and his heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear for himself. He reached Harrow Creek as the absolute earliest edge of pre-dawn was turning the eastern sky from black to the deepest possible indigo, that moment before light that was still fully dark but held the secret of dawn inside it. He rode to the boarding house. He flung himself off his horse. He hit the door with his fist hard enough to swing the lantern inside on its hook. And when Catherine opened the door with her gray eyes wide and her hair loose over her shoulders and her hand on the rifle she had been keeping within reach, he took her by both shoulders and he said what he had been saying in his head for 9 hours of hard riding. "They are coming at first light, so pack now." Now they were here, inside the boarding house with the clock on the mantel reading 4:45 in the morning and first light perhaps an hour away, and Catherine was moving with a speed and precision that told him she had been prepared for this, that some part of her had been prepared for this from the day she arrived. She moved through the small room that Mrs. Hurst had let her, pulling open the trunk under the bed and taking out the things that mattered. Her sworn statement, the 9 pages, she folded into a leather-wrapped packet and pressed into the inside of her coat, close to her body, where it had lived since the day she wrote it. Her father's watch, small and gold, and the only thing she had of him. The box of letters from Dorothea Beale in San Antonio, which she looked at for one moment and then left, because they were not letters she needed to carry and Dorothea was safer not being carried into this. A change of clothes. The tin of chalk from the schoolhouse, which she included because she could not help it and Alfred did not say a word. He went to Mrs. Hurst's room and knocked. Mrs. Hurst was already awake. Of course she was. She had probably been awake for an hour. Catherine told her quickly what was happening and Mrs. Hurst listened with a face like iron and then pulled her into a brief, fierce hug and said, "You go, you do what you have to, and you come back when it's safe." Alfred had Mrs. Hurst's horse saddled within 5 minutes. He knew the horse had helped shoe it once. It was a good steady gray mare who would not bolt. He helped Catherine up and then mounted his own exhausted animal, and they went out of Harrow Creek heading south, into the scrub country, away from the Redstone Road. They did not take the road. Alfred knew this land the way a man knew his own skin after 7 years of riding every corner of it as a deputy. He knew the draws and the dry creek beds, and the arroyos that cut invisible paths through the brush. He took them off the road immediately and into the country, and they rode by starlight and the growing edge of pre-dawn, moving fast but intelligently, through terrain that was very difficult to follow without knowing it. He was thinking about 8 men, about their likely approach, about what Beaumont Hale had specifically instructed them to do, and whether the instruction was to bring her back or to silence her permanently. He had a sick certainty about which it was. Beaumont Hale was not a man who preserved witnesses. Beaumont Hale was a man who erased problems, and Catherine Sutton was a very specific kind of problem, the kind with 9 pages of sworn testimony in a leather packet inside her coat. They rode for 40 minutes before Alfred pulled up in the shelter of a rock formation he had used before, a cluster of limestone boulders and twisted cedar that offered visibility in all directions and cover from 3. Catherine pulled up beside him. Her face in the growing pre-dawn light was flushed from riding, and her hair was loose and wild from the speed, and she was completely, visibly unafraid in the way that people who had passed through fear into something on the other side of it were unafraid. "How far behind us?" she said. "They don't know we left," he said. "They'll come to the boarding house at first light and find you gone. That buys us time, but they'll spread out and start tracking." "How many?" 8, she absorbed this. "And us?" 2, he said. "But I know this country and they don't." He paused. "And I sent that telegram to Cooper Reese before I left Redstone. If he's as fast as I believe he is, he'll have a federal warrant and men moving within 48 hours. 2 days, she said, roughly. We need to stay ahead of Hale's men and stay alive for 2 days. She nodded. "Then let us start doing that." He looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light, and this complicated mass of emotion moved through him. Love and fear and pride, and the specific ache of a man who was very aware that he was holding something irreplaceable in his hands. "Catherine," he said. "Alfred," she said. "After, tell me after." He understood. He turned his horse and they went on. The first light came while they were moving, rose gold and cold, spreading across the flat horizon with the impartial beauty of a world that did not much care about the small urgencies of the people moving through it. Alfred pushed them southeast, toward the roughest stretch of country in Crockett County, limestone canyons and cedar breaks, and a series of dry watercourses that were a nightmare to navigate quickly if you did not know the paths. He knew every path. By mid-morning they were deep in the canyon country, moving along the floor of a dry creek bed under the shade of overhanging limestone. The horses were tired, and he stopped them at a seep spring he knew, a place where water came out of the rock face in a thin, constant thread that had kept many people and animals alive in this country. He let the horses drink slowly and carefully, and he and Catherine ate from the small pack he had thrown together, dried beef and hard bread and 2 apples that had been in his saddlebag for 2 days but were still good. They sat on a flat rock near the spring and ate and did not talk much, but the silence was not tense. It was the silence of 2 people who had passed through enough together to be quiet without explanation. "Do you know a safe place?" she asked eventually. "There's a homestead," he said, "about 12 miles further south. A woman named Inez Vargas and her son. She's lived here 15 years. She knows me. She'd take us in for a night. 12 miles. We can make it by late afternoon if we push." She looked at her horse. "The mare is tired. She's a good horse. She'll make it." They rode. The midday sun was hard in the way only a Texas October could be, still warm enough to make sweat while the shade was genuinely cold. The canyon walls gave way to open scrub and then rose again, and they moved through the varying terrain with Alfred always a few lengths ahead, always watching the ridgelines. He saw the dust at roughly 1 in the afternoon. Distant several miles north, moving along what would have been the road if they had taken the road. His stomach tightened and he calculated. The dust was moving in the right direction, but it was moving on the road, which meant whoever it was had taken the obvious route from Harrow Creek south, which was the Redstone Road, and they had not yet understood that their quarry had gone cross-country. "Don't look at it," he said quietly when Catherine turned her head. "Keep your eyes forward and keep the same pace." She did. The dust moved parallel to them for a time and then fell behind as their routes diverged. He let out a slow breath. The men on the road would eventually realize they had missed the trail and circle back. But by then, he and Catherine would be through the canyon section, and in terrain that was even harder to move fast in. They reached the Vargas homestead as the sun was getting low, a small adobe house and a stock pen, and a kitchen garden that was producing its last of the season against the descending cold. A boy of about 12 came out of the pen and stared at them, and Alfred called to him in Spanish, which was how he always started with the Vargas family. Inez Vargas came out of the house a moment later, a compact woman of perhaps 50 with black hair going silver and eyes that had looked at hard things without looking away from them. She looked at Alfred and at Catherine and at their hard-ridden horses, and she said, also in Spanish, "Get inside." They got inside. Inez fed them and did not ask too many questions. She had seen enough of the politics of West Texas to understand the broad shape of any situation that involved a woman and a deputy arriving at her door by backcountry routes. She gave them water to wash with and a meal of beans and dried chili and fresh tortillas that was the finest thing Catherine had eaten in weeks, and she put them in the 2 rooms she had. Alfred sat up through most of the night with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark. Inez's boy, whose name was Tomas, offered to watch the North Trail, and Alfred accepted, because Tomas knew the ground and had eyes that had grown up tracking movement in brush country. Catherine slept for 4 hours in Inez's second room, the deep, hard sleep of pure physical exhaustion. When she woke before dawn, the room was still dark, and for one terrible moment she did not know where she was, and then she heard the horses outside and the low voices of Alfred and Tomas, and she was back. She got up and found Alfred in the main room. He looked hollowed out, she thought. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He had been riding and moving and watching for 36 hours without real rest. "Sleep," she said. "I'm Alfred. 3 hours. I'll watch." He looked at her for a moment, and then something in him let go just enough, and he went to the chair near the window and folded himself into it and was asleep almost immediately, his rifle still in his hands, his head dropping to one side. She watched him sleep, and she felt the weight of everything they were carrying and everything they were to each other in the particular way that you felt large things at 4 in the morning when the world was still, and she thought with a fierce, quiet clarity, "We are going to get through this. We are going to get through this, and then we are going to have the actual life that is waiting for us on the other side of it." She made herself believe that completely because she needed it to be true, and because some things needed to be willed into being. At 8 in the morning, Tomas came in from his watch post at a run and said there were riders, 3 of them coming from the west. Alfred was on his feet before Catherine had time to speak, the rifle in his hands, and Inez was dousing the cooking fire and pointing toward the root cellar with a look that brooked no argument. Catherine did not argue. She went into the root cellar with Inez, into the cool dark beneath the house, and she put her hand inside her coat and felt the leather packet with her 9 pages of testimony and held it there, her fingers against it, and she waited. The riders came. She heard them through the boards above, the horses, the voices. She heard Alfred's voice, controlled and deputorial, and one of the other voices asking questions. She pressed herself back against the earthen wall of the cellar and breathed. The conversation lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Then there was silence. Then footsteps across the boards above and Alfred's voice saying clearly, "They're gone." They came up out of the cellar and Alfred told them quickly. The 3 riders were not Hale's men. They were local ranchers looking for their missing stock, who had heard there was trouble in the area and wanted to know if the deputy needed assistance. Alfred had thanked them and sent them on their way without revealing exactly who he was protecting or why. One of the ranchers, A man named Callum Briggs, who Alfred vouched for, had offered something more valuable than muscle. He had been in Redstone yesterday and had spoken to people who told him that federal marshals had arrived in Redstone early that morning. Federal marshals, plural, with a warrant. Catherine grabbed Alfred's arm. He was already nodding, already calculating. "Cooper Reese," he said. "He moved faster than I hoped. They'll be coming this way. I told Reese in my telegram to come south from Redstone. He'd take the main road which would bring him through the edge of canyon country." He looked at her. "If we ride north now, we could intercept them rather than waiting for them to find us. That means going back toward Hale's men. It means going toward federal protection, which is more important." She looked at him, this man who had ridden 9 hours in the dark to warn her, who had stayed awake through 2 nights, who was calculating the angles of her survival with a precision and devotion that she intended to spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "All right," she said. "We go north." They thanked Inez Vargas with everything they had, which was not much materially but was genuine and deep, and Inez held Catherine's hands for a moment and looked at her steadily and said in Spanish, "Go become who you need to be. Come back when you can." Catherine was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She mounted the gray mare and she did not cry. They went north. Alfred took them on a route that ran roughly parallel to the main road but stayed in the brush, close enough to intersect with anyone coming south on the road, without being visible to anyone coming north looking for them. It was a precise and difficult calculation, and he made it with the quiet confidence of a man who genuinely knew every fold in this particular piece of ground. They heard the horses before they saw them. A group moving south on the road at a steady pace, the specific rhythm of horses being ridden by men who had a purpose and were not hurrying but were not dawdling either. Alfred pulled up and listened and then said, "Federal," which was not a word she had expected him to be able to determine from the sound of hooves, but apparently he could. And when they pushed through the last screen of brush to the road's edge, she saw that he was right. There were 5 of them, riders in the dark coats and with the particular posture of federal lawmen, and at the front was a man with a silver mustache and sharp eyes who pulled his horse up sharply when they appeared out of the brush. "Alfred Slater," this man said. "Cooper Reese," Alfred said. "You moved fast." "Your telegram was not subtle," said Reese. "Are you Catherine Sutton?" "I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded once with something that might have been respect. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Beaumont Hale for the murder of federal surveyor George Tasker, based in part on the sworn testimony you provided to Deputy Slater. Do you have that testimony on your person?" She reached into her coat and pulled out the leather packet. 9 pages, she said. "Every detail." "Good," said Reese. He looked at Alfred. "Hale has 7 men currently operating in this area looking for Miss Sutton. I have 5. I'd like your local knowledge." "You have it," Alfred said immediately. "All of it." What followed was 2 hours of coordinated movement through the canyon country, with Alfred guiding the federal marshals along the routes that gave them the best angles on the positions where Hale's men were most likely operating. Alfred communicated positions and terrain with a fluency that had Reese's men looking at each other with quiet approval, and Catherine rode with them, close to Alfred, watching him work and understanding with a new clarity why the people of Crockett County trusted him the way they did. The first confrontation came when they rounded the head of a canyon and found 2 of Hale's men watering their horses at a stock tank. The men went for their guns and Reese's marshals had them covered before either weapon cleared leather. The men were told to stand down and they did, because federal marshals with drawn guns and very clear jurisdiction were a different proposition than ordinary sheriffs, and both men were clearly experienced enough at operating in legal gray zones to recognize when they had moved into a zone that was not gray at all. They were disarmed and their horses were confiscated, and they were left tied to a cedar with enough slack to free themselves by evening, which was federal policy and also practical, since nobody wanted to escort prisoners through brush country. Over the next 4 hours, they found 4 more of Hale's men through variations of the same process. Alfred reading the terrain and anticipating positions. Reese's marshals executing the interceptions with professional precision. One man bolted and was caught. One cooperated immediately and provided, under Reese's direct questioning, the confirmation that Beaumont Hale himself had sent them, with specific orders, and that those orders did not involve bringing Catherine Sutton back alive. Catherine listened to this and felt the cold of it move through her, and then felt something else move through her right behind it, something harder and cleaner, which was a complete and final resolution. She had been right to run. She had been right to stay. She had been right to write those 9 pages. She had been right to tell Alfred. Every choice she had made from that alley in San Antonio to this moment had been right, and the darkness that had chased her across 170 miles of Texas was about to meet a force it had not fully prepared for. The last 2 of Hale's men were found near the road and surrendered without incident when they saw the numbers against them. Reese reined in and looked at Alfred. 7 accounted for. The telegram you sent mentioned 8. The scout, Alfred said. He came through Harrow Creek and went back. He'd have reported to Hale directly. Hale's in Austin, Reese said. He was still in Austin when we left. We have men there. He paused. Hale will be in custody by this time tomorrow. The certainty in his voice was the most beautiful sound Catherine had heard in 7 months. The return to Harrow Creek was not rapid. They traveled with the federal party, and by the time they arrived at the edge of town, the sun was going down and the town was lit warm against the dark descending evening. They had been gone less than 40 hours, but it felt like much longer, in the way that time always felt longer when it was very full. Sheriff Moss was waiting at the edge of town, having heard riders coming, and when he saw the federal party and Alfred and Catherine, he crossed his arms and looked at Alfred with an expression that combined relief and exasperation in more or less equal measure. "I thought you rode to Redstone," he said. "I did," Alfred said. "And then I rode back, and then I rode south, and then north. It's been a long day, Virgil." Moss looked at Catherine. "You all right, Miss Sutton?" "I am," she said. "Better than all right." Cooper Reese and his men stayed in Harrow Creek that night, and Reese sat with Catherine for 3 hours and took additional testimony, and had her sign her name to documents that would form the foundation of the federal case against Beaumont Hale. Reese was thorough and professional, and treated her testimony with the specific gravity that it deserved, as the account of a witness to murder who had carried that knowledge through 7 months of danger without once flinching from it. Alfred was present for all of it, sitting to her left, not saying much, being there. When Reese was finally done and the documents were secured, he shook Catherine's hand and said, "You are a brave woman, Miss Sutton. What you did took real courage." "What I did was survive," she said. "The courage is in Deputy Slater's saddle bag somewhere, along with 9 hours of dark road." Reese glanced at Alfred with something like amusement. Alfred said nothing, but the expression on his face when he looked at Catherine said everything. The next morning, Reese and his men rode back toward Austin. Beaumont Hale was arrested at his estate in Austin that afternoon. The arrest was made by federal marshals with a warrant signed by a federal judge, supported by the sworn testimony of Catherine Sutton, corroborated by the confessions of 2 of Hale's own men, who very quickly decided that the man paying their wages was significantly less frightening in custody than federal prison was in prospect. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. In the weeks between the arrest and the deepening of winter, Harrow Creek settled back into itself with the particular relief of a community that had been holding its breath without quite knowing it. The children came back to school. Ellen Prout finished her 2nd reader and started her 3rd. The Tremblay brothers competed their way through an entire arithmetic workbook and started on the next. The schoolhouse latch that Alfred had repaired held through the first cold snaps without complaint. Alfred came to the boarding house on a Tuesday evening in the first week of November and knocked on the door, and when Catherine answered it, he was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual way. "I have something I want to say," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat at the small table where she took her meals, and she sat across from him and Mrs. Hurst's cat installed itself on the windowsill with the air of a creature who intended to observe but maintain plausible deniability. "I have been trying to find the right time for this for several weeks," Alfred said, "and I have come to the conclusion that there is no right time and I should simply say it." "Then say it," she said. He looked at her steadily. The lamplight was warm on his face, and the lines around his eyes were a little deeper than they had been in March, but the expression in those dark eyes was the most open thing she had ever seen from him. "I love you, Catherine. I have loved you since about the fourth time you let me walk you home, and somehow that walk took 2 hours, and I still can't account for where the time went. I want to marry you, if you'll have me. I want to give you the kind of settled, safe, ordinary life that you have earned about 10 times over and have never been able to have. I want to have children with you and fight with you about whether the dog sleeps inside, and watch you turn completely impossible students into people who love learning and grow old with you in this county that I know you have come to love, because I can see it in the way you look at the landscape, and I feel the same way about it." She was quiet for a moment. "The dog does sleep inside," she said. "I know," he said. "I've already made peace with it." She stood up from the table and came around to him, and he stood, and she took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers in the schoolhouse all those weeks ago, and she kissed him with her whole heart. When she pulled back, she said, "Yes, Alfred, obviously yes, completely and without reservation yes." The expression that came over his face was the most purely happy thing she had seen in years. He laughed once, a real laugh, and pulled her close, and she put her head against his chest and felt his heart beating fast and steady, and she thought, this exact thing. This is what was waiting on the other side. They were married in December, 6 weeks later, in the Harrow Creek Presbyterian Church on a Sunday afternoon with the whole town present, because in small towns there are no private events, and this was fine with both of them. Reverend Marsh presided with a dignity that was slightly undermined by his dog running into the church halfway through the ceremony and sitting expectantly next to Alfred, who was very carefully not laughing. Sheriff Moss was Alfred's witness. Mrs. Hurst was Catherine's, and wore a hat with 3 feathers that she had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion. Catherine wore the dress she had brought from San Antonio, deep blue wool with ivory buttons, not traditionally bridal but absolutely herself, and she walked down the aisle with the self-possession of a woman who had earned the right to walk into anything. When Reverend Marsh asked her if she took this man, she said yes with a clarity and conviction that went beyond the formal requirements of the ceremony, and seemed to carry the weight of everything they had been through, every careful conversation on a porch or a creek bank, every moment of trust offered and received, 9 hours of dark road and a fist on a door and a voice saying, "Pack now." Alfred took her hands and said his vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking straight at her, not at the congregation or the reverend or the window, just at her, and the words had the quality of promises that would be kept. Then he kissed her, and the church made a sound that was half applause and half the exhaled breath of people who had been quietly hoping for this for a long time. In the spring of 1883, Beaumont Hale stood trial in Austin before a federal judge. Catherine traveled to Austin with Alfred and Cooper Reese's full support, and she testified for 2.5 days with the 9 pages of sworn testimony as her foundation and her memory as its unflinching corroboration. She described the alley. She described the light. She described Beaumont Hale's face turning toward her. She described the dead man on the ground and the silence after. The defense lawyers were expensive and aggressive and tried every technique available to them. They challenged her credibility, her motives, her character, her presence in the alley. They suggested she had invented the story. They suggested she had a personal vendetta against their client. They were thorough and skilled and ultimately insufficient, because the corroborating testimony of 2 of Hale's own hired men, combined with documentary evidence about the fraudulent land surveys, and a letter recovered from Hale's correspondence explicitly referring to the surveyor as a problem that had been handled, built a structure around Catherine's testimony that was very difficult to dismantle. Beaumont Hale was convicted of murder in the second degree on the morning of April the 14th, 1883. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Catherine sat in the courtroom gallery when the verdict was read, and she felt Alfred's hand take hers and squeeze once, and she let out a breath that she had been holding, in one form or another, since the 3rd of March the previous year. It did not feel like triumph exactly. George Tasker was still dead, and justice for his death was not the same as his life. The fraudulent land acquisitions would take years of legal work to fully untangle, and the land rights of the communities who had been displaced in the process would require a sustained federal attention that might or might not materialize. The world was not clean and simple and made right by a single verdict. But something had been settled. The secret she had carried was a secret no longer. The danger that had chased her across 170 miles was caged. The truth she had written with her own hands in a boarding house in West Texas while a cold October turned into winter had been heard in a federal courtroom and weighed and found sufficient. She turned to Alfred, and he was looking at her with that expression she had come to know completely, the one that held everything. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she said. They rode back to Harrow Creek in the warm April sun, and the Texas landscape did what it always did in April, which was to become briefly and extravagantly beautiful, the bluebonnets coming in along the roadsides in great drifts of blue-purple, the prickly pear blooming yellow, the cedar washed clean and green, the sky that impossible blue. Alfred rode beside her, and neither of them said much, and they did not need to. Harrow Creek was waiting for them the way a place waited when you had become part of it. The schoolhouse was ready for the last 2 months of the term. Mrs. Hurst was ready with a dinner that had apparently been in preparation for 2 days. Pocket the dog, who now lived in the Slater house at the edge of town, was ecstatically ready with the particular undiscriminating joy of dogs who had been without the people they preferred for a week. Catherine was back at her chalkboard on Monday morning, and the children were as sharp and curious and fundamentally good as they had always been, and she looked at them over her primer and felt the full weight of this life she had made and chose and would choose again every morning, the life that had been built out of running and fear and 9 pages of handwritten truth, and a man who had ridden through the night. In September of 1883, Catherine told Alfred he was going to be a father. He was in the yard mending a fence post, and he went very still when she said it. Then he set down his tools with a deliberate care and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said in the quietest possible voice, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said, smiling. "And you're sure?" "Alfred, I'm sure." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them there was that expression, the open one, unguarded and complete. "A father," he said, almost to himself, as though testing the word's weight. "That is typically what this makes you, yes." He kissed her forehead with a gentleness that she would remember for the rest of her life. "I'll be a good one," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I have never doubted that." Their son was born in May of 1884 in the Slater house with the doctor from town in attendance, and Mrs. Hurst providing opinions from the hall that nobody had requested but everyone appreciated. He was a healthy boy with dark eyes like his father and a forthright quality about his crying that suggested he had things to communicate and intended to communicate them. Alfred held him for the first time in the afternoon light that came through the bedroom window, and Catherine watched her husband hold their son with the same focused, complete attention he brought to every important thing, and she thought, "This is everything. This is the whole of it." They named him James, for Catherine's father, with the middle name George, for George Tasker, whose death had set everything in motion. James was curious and energetic, and, as it turned out, exactly as uninterested in conventional limits as his mother, which Alfred regarded with the resigned affection of a man who had married the most stubborn woman in Crockett County, and was not even slightly sorry about it. In 1886, a daughter arrived, who they named Mary after no one in particular, and for every woman they had both admired. She was small and quiet at first, and then extremely loud and opinionated, which Alfred said was clearly her mother's influence, and Catherine said was clearly the combined influence of the entire West Texas landscape, which did not reward people who were not specific about what they needed. By 1887, Alfred had been appointed sheriff of Crockett County, Virgil Moss having retired to a small property outside Harrow Creek, where he grew tomatoes and kept very opinionated chickens. The appointment was not contested because there was genuinely no one in the county who questioned Alfred Slater's fitness for the job, and even the people who had privately thought that marrying the schoolteacher had softened him had come to understand that what they were seeing was not softness, but the specific kind of strength that came from having something worth protecting and knowing exactly how to protect it. Catherine continued to teach. She had turned down 2 offers from larger towns, one from Redstone and one from a newly established school in a growing town to the east, because she was not interested in larger towns. She was interested in Harrow Creek, in these specific children and this specific classroom, and the hand-pump organ in the corner that someone had finally managed to tune to something approaching its proper pitch. She also, in 1888, got a letter from Dorothea Beale in San Antonio. The letter had been forwarded through 3 intermediaries and had taken 6 months to find her, but it had found her. Dorothea had read about the Hale trial in the newspaper and had understood immediately what had happened and where Catherine had gone and why. And the letter was equal parts love and relief, and the extremely specific kind of anger that came from a very good friend who had been worried for 2 years and needed to express it before she could move on to everything else. Catherine sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, and then she wrote back, 10 pages, everything she had not been able to say for 6 years, every detail she had not been able to risk, and she sent it directly to Dorothea's address in San Antonio. Dorothea Beale visited Harrow Creek in the summer of 1889 and stayed for 3 weeks, and the house was very full and very loud, and Alfred bore it with the calm of a man who had made his peace with the particular energetic quality that surrounded his wife in all her relationships. Dorothea took one look at Alfred and said to Catherine privately, "He rode 9 hours through the night for you." "He did," Catherine said. "I have nothing more to say," said Dorothea. On a Sunday evening in the fall of 1889, Alfred and Catherine sat on the porch of the Slater house at the edge of Harrow Creek, which was slightly larger than it had been when they moved in, and had a proper vegetable garden that Catherine had coaxed out of the difficult soil over years of patient work. Pocket the dog was asleep under the porch. James, now 5, was inside with Mary, 3, and the sounds of a cooperative game that would inevitably become a dispute were drifting through the open window. The sun was going down over the flat Texas horizon in the particular violent beauty of a West Texas October, the same kind of sunset that had been over this landscape when they first knew each other, orange and red above the flat line of the earth. Alfred put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and felt the steady warmth of him. "Do you ever think about where you would be if you had not come to Harrow Creek?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I would have gone somewhere else and been smaller and more afraid for a long time. And instead," she considered the word, "instead I am here," she said, "which is the exact correct place to be." He pressed his lips to her temple, a quiet, unhurried gesture, the kind that belonged to people who had a whole life of such gestures ahead of them. "I rode through worse than 9 hours of dark road for you," he said. "I would do it again tomorrow." "I know," she said. "I know you would." "And you," he said, 9 pages of truth in a leather packet, you carried that for 7 months." "It needed to be carried," she said simply. He held her a little closer. Inside the house, the cooperative game had indeed become a dispute, and James's voice and Mary's voice were rising together in the specific overlapping cadence of small children who both had strong feelings about whatever had just occurred. Alfred did not move. "They'll sort it out," he said. "They will," Catherine agreed. The sun completed its descent, and the stars began to appear, the way they always did in this particular piece of sky over Crockett County, one at a time and then all at once, the great clear spread of the Texas night coming in with the cold from the north, and the horizon still faintly warm on the west. The sound from inside the house changed, dispute resolving into something else, the quiet of children moving toward sleep or the sound of one comforting the other, impossible to tell from outside. Catherine thought about all the roads that had led here. The alley in San Antonio, the stage from San Antonio to Harrow Creek, the road from the school to the boarding house, the road Alfred had ridden through the dark, the federal courtroom in Austin, the road home. Every road had led here to this porch, this man, this house, these two children who were her most extraordinary achievement and her greatest daily challenge, this landscape that had taught her something she had not known she needed to learn about staying in a place long enough for it to become yours. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid in a long time. The fear had been replaced by something with more density to it, more substance, the solid, comfortable weight of a life that was built rather than borrowed, earned rather than stumbled into. Alfred turned his head and looked at her in the starlight. "I love you, Catherine," he said, "today and every day." She looked back at him, this man with the dark eyes and the bent deputy badge he no longer wore, the man who had come to her door in the blue-black hour before dawn with the wind of 9 hours in his coat, and the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided what mattered most. "I love you, Alfred," she said, completely and without reservation and with no intention of stopping. He smiled at her, openly, the way he had learned to smile in the years since the careful distance had fallen away, the way that still transformed his face into something that made her feel like the luckiest person in Crockett County. They sat there together on the porch of the Slater house as the stars came fully in above West Texas, and the night settled around them, warm and dark and full of the sounds of a living place. And inside the house 2 children slept, and outside the horse moved in the small corral, and the dog under the porch snored gently, and the land stretched away in all directions, rough and beautiful and uncompromising, the land that had made them both harder and stranger and truer than they would have been anywhere else. The dark past was done. The hidden motives were exposed and answered for. The secret that had traveled 170 miles in a leather pocket close to a heartbeat had been spoken aloud in a federal courtroom and found sufficient. The trap had been sprung and survived. The forbidden thing they had wanted and been afraid to reach for had been reached for and held. The story that had begun with fear and flight, and a fist on a door in the dark had arrived at this, at 2 people on a porch in October 1889, watching the stars come in over the Texas horizon, holding the life they had built together against everything that had tried to prevent it, which was the only kind of life worth having. They stayed on that porch until the cold drove them in, and then they went inside to their children and their house and their good dog, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the window was warm, and the night outside was quiet and large and entirely, peacefully safe.